Good afternoon. It's Joyful Hermit. Make sure my sound is up. Yes. I want to share my conversion. And it started way back when I was about 4 or 5, I think, when a new little neighbor girl moved in next door, a whole family. They had at the time, they had just had the 6th child, and 7 and 8 were born after they moved in. And it was very fun to have a little girlfriend right next door. She was a year older, and they were a Catholic family. So that began sort of my indoctrination by my mother and grandmother and my father. Mostly I remember my mother and my grandmother would not make many statements, but at times, not often, but when I asked a question once, I could tell she was displeased and thought it was terrible, something that little Peggy had said. But we were coloring at Christmas time. I had a Christmas nativity coloring book, and we were coloring over at my house, and upstairs in it's called a day room. It's an old Italianate house from the 1800s that I grew up in for my first 14 years. And she was talking to me about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and of course I knew that, but being a Protestant, we didn't have much talk about Mary at all. It was always Jesus was the main one to be mentioned, of course, and that's right, as Son of God. But she said how important it was, so I thought, well, my favorite color and crayon was the red one. So I chose the red crayon to color Mary and her outfit, And Peggy says, oh, no, you're supposed to use blue. And she said, you could go to purgatory for that, for coloring her with red clothing. And of course, I was horrified. I didn't know what purgatory was, but it sounded bad. I knew that. I knew it wasn't good, the way Peggy said it. And I told my grandmother after Peggy went home what she had said, and that I'd used my very best color. I didn't have just a little stub of red left to color Mary's clothing. And my grandmother was up. She says, you pay no attention to that. I forget what she said, something, not hogwash, but something similar. Maybe she used the word hogwash. So, but then a couple other things that Peggy would say just sort of intrigued me. She went to the Catholic private school, and she went to church every morning. She called it Mass, and I wasn't familiar with that, but what the school children would, and I thought, oh, that sounded nice. I always liked religion. I liked going to church and Sunday school when I was little. My parents were Methodists. I grew up Methodist, and we went every Sunday without fail unless we were sick. And then once we had our lake house when I was 5, my dad had found a little lake house on a lake, and we got that. My grandmother helped with the little loan and everything, so we would go to the lake every summer and spend the summers there. And we would either have our own devotions out on the lake, or go to a church there, or there was a lakeside service that we would go to. But and my dad too, very insistent, always go to church. We always said prayers before meals, and we were told to say a bedtime prayer. On our own we could. And when we were real little, I think one or other of our parents, my dad traveled, so it's mostly my mother. But anyway, that was my religious upbringing. But also, the church where Peggy went and her school was behind our house and over a street. So there was our house, and then another person's house. We were sort of up on a hill. Another person's house down below, and then up on another hill was this church. And the back of the church, this big spire that went up, it's sort of rounded out area, brick. and the trees and all in the winter time with the sun setting in the west would silhouette that church, the tower, and I was always drawn to that scene from the back room of our house. That when I was maybe in fifth or sixth grade or fourth grade, my mother and dad had it, took this, what was it, just a storage room. Used to be an old carriage house where they would keep the carriage, but they made it into what was back then called a rec room, recreational room. Well, it was a lovely room, and my mother liked it especially. She'd sit in the evenings in the sun setting. But I was always drawn to the back of that church. It was rounded, and the spire there, and the beautiful sun filtering through, and especially in the winter with the branches stark going up. Couldn't see it as well in the summer with the trees in the way. So I was always drawn to that. I even tried to watercolor it once, or paint it or draw it, and tried to get the colors right. It was really captivated me. So, and then we moved to a subdivision, a new one. They were just coming in vogue in 1964 in this hometown of mine. And next door, next door to the house my parents had built by this builder, and a builder built a spec home next to us. And a family, a man and his wife, and 2 daughters moved in. And one daughter was my age, but she went to the Catholic high school. And it turns out that the man, he was employed by a major publishing company. He was for a newspaper, Catholic, and he was a columnist, a national columnist for it. And my mom somehow, they liked that couple very much, really enjoyed them. He was very intelligent, his wife was, and literary. He had been a Methodist minister who had converted to Catholicism. He had married originally a Catholic woman, and she had gotten ill with cancer and had died, with the one daughter they had, and a boy who was disabled. And the boy ended up dying with his disability and handicap. And then this man remarried, also another Catholic woman, because he had converted to Catholicism, left his Methodist minister position, and converted to Catholicism. He had done a radio station show or something, or program. After his conversion, as part of his work, he needed to find work. It's hard to find work when you're a Methodist minister and you convert to Catholicism. And then he got hired as a columnist for this national publication and publishing company. And my mother was very intelligent and interested in reading and writing as an English teacher and all. So she enjoyed talking with Dale and Margaret quite a bit. And Dale had also written and had a book published too that I read. It was about his life and his conversion and different aspects of his life. So and then they had this second wife, and he had a little girl also. So I knew of the daughter, and she invited me one time to a play. It was their senior play or some play at their high school. And I went with her, and I remember entering their gym where they had their auditorium or gym where they had the play. And then afterwards, there was like a gathering to talk and all of that in a convent house where a lot of the school teachers had lived. And I hadn't been around religious sisters before or in a facility like that. And something was inside me that felt keen, heightened. I sensed holiness. I sensed holiness in that building, in that convent house. And the play wasn't a religious play. It was positive and clean and everything as would be in 1968 or 69. 68, I guess it was. I think it was in the fall. And, but also in intervening years, I knew my parents and my family, they were against Catholicism, but they had some Catholic friends, just like the next door people when I was in high school. And however, so that was a little bit different for me to know that my parents were very opposed. My eldest sister dated a Catholic, and my parents were very upset and did all they could to break it up, and she was grounded, and I remember the her yelling, and she stood up to anything my eldest sister did. And I wished she hadn't too. I remember she was held her own and argued back and spoke up and all of that, and did what she wanted, and didn't mind if with my mother's temper. Well, I didn't want my mother's temper, and I sensed, even though I was young, that my middle sister was very, very sensitive and sad a lot, or sort of melancholy, and I would always try to cheer her up. And but when she was with her friends and all, she was just fine, and she had lots of friends. Both my sisters had lots of friends. The eldest one had lots of boyfriends. She was really into boys in high school. So we had that going on. And the problem with this Catholic boy, my parents were very concerned. My dad also very much. And he was reared that way. Don't date Catholics. But yet they would have these adult Catholic friends and seemed just fine. They weren't at all rude to them or anything. So it was a different dynamic. And I'm grateful my parents were very kindly and had friends who were Catholic and didn't let what they were brought up as. And then I also had an uncle. My grandmother, my beloved grandmother, my other grandmother had died before I was born, a year before I was born. But the grandmother I knew well and was very close with, because my mother had gone back to finish her college and then got a master's degree when I was, after I was born. And she felt, she needed something for herself, I guess, and did that. And it was wonderful. And then she started teaching when I was in kindergarten. So my grandmother lived with us. So my mother would take classes, and I was really closer to my grandmother than my mother when I was little, when I was preschool and 2, 3, 4, and 5 years old. And then when my mother taught, my grandmother would be there. I would come home from kindergarten and spend the afternoon. I'd have a nap or something, but lunch and talk with grandmother, and I liked to hear about how it was when she was growing up, or how my aunts and uncles, how it was for them. And I liked history. And later my mother would say how my grandmother would say, oh, that I would never stop with the questions. I would never stop with the questions. Would keep her going. And my grandmother would take me with her to her ladies' aids meetings and things. I loved doing that. I was the only child there one time. I think another grandmother had her granddaughter, so that was fun. But I had a very lovely childhood. But I knew that Catholicism was not approved of, Catholics. And when I was in first grade and towards second grade, my mother put the kibosh, or even third grade also, the kibosh on my playing with Peggy. We were best of friends, had the most fun. I loved it when they'd have another new baby, and Peggy would invite me over to see the baby. And it was all that big, huge family. It just all seemed wonderful to me. And anyway, it was Peggy was, I think, the fourth born. Yes, so she had four younger than her and three older. So, but yeah, my mother said I couldn't play with Peggy anymore, that I had to find other friends before I could play with Peggy again. So, and that's how things can happen. That my mother, I think she wanted me to make other friends. But I always sensed something about Catholics. I sensed a depth or something very spiritual or something different about them. Something in their hearts. It sounds weird, but I sensed something in them, in other Catholic children. And when I got into high school then, I sensed something with the neighbors and their daughter, that there was something deeper and inside of them. So, really, it wasn't until I never went into a Catholic church. After college, I think I was still a junior or a senior. Peggy graduated and she got married in the Catholic Church, and my parents and myself went to the wedding. So my parents were fine about going to the wedding. And I was captivated, and when I was in that church, though, I looked at the stained glass windows, and there was one with Mary, in which Mary had a red mantle, a red cape or cloak in the stained glass. They were stained glass from the 1800s, very old stained glass that were brought from Europe for this church. And there was a German Catholic church in the town, and about a block and a half away was the Irish Catholic Church. And they were sort of known to be the Irish and the Germans in that hometown had trouble getting along until in my time they all did, but in the history of the town. So, but I remembered seeing that red and remembered back and had sort of a chuckle about it, that it was okay after all that I had colored the Virgin Mary with red. There it was in their stained glass windows. That was when I was about 21 years old and Peggy got married there. And I remember the wedding. That was the first Catholic service. I didn't realize it was a mass or a wedding mass or anything like that. I do remember Peggy taking her bouquet and placing it over at an altar on the left that had a statue of Mary on it. And over to the right was an altar with a statue of Joseph on it. But so that was my experience with Catholicism growing up. But I did feel that something inside Catholics I met, that there was something different. In 8th grade, some of the boys from the Catholic school came to my grade school, the public school. And it was, I think, for the sports and to get a head start into going to the public high school. For those parents who wanted their boys to be in sports programs that were larger and more competitive, was to go to the public high school. But that was the first time I was around Catholic boys, and there were some Catholic girls, not many, in the public school, but I still sense that something different in them. So, jump ahead, way ahead, I married, and when we would move to different places, when my husband at the time would get a new position in a school district, one time I remember seeing this church up on a hill, and I said, why don't we try that church? Well, it happened to be Catholic. And my ex-husband, the husband at the time, no, I will never do that. I would never belong to that church. And I was always the one that would find us the churches. We would go to different churches. I insisted on going to church. That's how I was reared, and that was my interest also, was in religion, and to have my children religiously reared. So that was the next little thing that was just sort of odd. It stuck in me as odd, as to, for one thing, that I wanted to try that church, to go there. And I realized it was Catholic then. But the reaction of my husband at the time, which I didn't quite understand why he would have that animosity. Don't know. He's not been to church since he was married to me, so I don't know what the deal was, but that was the other thing. And then right before the husband had left, this would be in 1984, and in 1985 I taught a semester at a high school, Beverly Hills High, and in the cafeteria at lunchtime there was a table with different teachers, and this one man teacher beckoned me over, just friendly, nothing to it, but join us at our table. He happened to be the art teacher at the high school, very nice man. And the other teachers and they would have the most fascinating conversations. Well, now I realize they might have been Catholics there. I knew the man teacher was, the art teacher was. But he looked at me. This is the first time I had lunch with them. And he was insistent. He says, you need to read this book that I know of. And it was Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline. And I didn't get it then, but I remembered the name, because something about this art teacher stuck with me that I needed to read that book. So I was only there a semester. The divorce was starting. I needed to get the children moved to a smaller area in Southern California where I had friends and family, because my back was ruined from the car accident. I hadn't had the first surgery yet. But I ended up then finding that book and reading it. And that's how I got introduced to Thomas Merton, Catholic writer. He was a convert himself, but he wrote profusely and excellent books. Merton did. He was a great writer and well thought. He thought through various aspects of religion, and Catholicism also. He was a monk at Abbey of Gethsemane after he converted. And so I was familiar with some of the quotes of Merton in this book by Richard Foster, Celebration of Discipline. So I didn't go to a Catholic church or anything there. I went to a Lutheran one. My family doctor said, come to our church, trying to welcome us and help my children get settled in. Very nice family they were. And so we went to their church and got involved in this Lutheran church and met lovely people and other children for my children to play with. And then the next encounter I had that stuck out to me was one daughter played softball. The other daughter wanted to play Little League with the boys. Well, the girls' softball team she would have been in wasn't as good as her older sister's softball team. And both my daughters were very athletic. So she was the first girl on the softball team in this town in Southern California. And some of the women from the church, their sons were on, three of the women, and they sort of made a deal of it to me, of putting it down, what are you doing? What are you doing now? To me, I even then had this way, I guess, of irking some people or having people think maybe I stood out or in some way as different. It must have been something like that. I couldn't figure out. But I sat in these bleachers for the games and would be there to pick her up from practice or take her to practice. And I sat by a woman one time. She says, "Oh, welcome me, come sit here." And we got to talking, and the woman said, the book you would love to read is The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. And then she mentioned that she was Catholic. Turns out we probably sat, most games then, or practices at least, or practice. The practice games would be after school with other teams. It wasn't like a high school sport. I think my daughter was in 5th grade then, 5th grade. So the mothers were mostly there watching. In other words, the dads were still at work. So I was divorced then. And so we became friends in a way, not outside of the games, but it was nice to have someone want to talk with me. And when I had ill reception from the women I knew from church, so because of my daughter being on the team, people can get funny over the strangest things. So, and I was the only divorcee in this church I went to, the Lutheran church. And that was a big thing for a lot of the women. I think they were very threatened by me and very protective of their husbands. I wasn't interested in their husbands, but they didn't realize that. And I was a sweet young thing then. So, and I did have some of the husbands were interested in me, 2 or 3 of them, and I had to squash that. But because I wasn't interested, and I'm not that type of person. So, but this woman, so I got the book and read it. But maybe it was because I had already been, there was one bookstore in town, it's the Christian bookstore. And I had also gotten a book. The bookstore owner had said I would like it. And it was by Teresa of Avila. I didn't know who that was. Didn't know she was Catholic until I started reading it. But I had already read Celebration of Discipline and knew of Thomas Merton's writings. So I read The Seven-Story Mountain and then got hooked on other of his early books. Seeds of Contemplation, New Seeds of Contemplation. Excellent books. But I've mentioned in other videos, you don't go further. Don't go where you can if you want. But he got enamored with Buddhism. I had already done my exploring of other religions and trying to figure out where I fit in with what I later found out are mystical phenomenon and experiences, spiritual experiences. But it took me reading Catholic books to find out about these things, about what was wrong with me, or not wrong, but why I was how I was, and had been all my life. But it really blossomed. It really blossomed when I was married and further on, and after he left, I guess while I was married, things would happen. He didn't like it. I didn't realize my husband didn't like it. It frightened him or unnerved him. And partly because I would know things. And he was doing all these bad things on the side. So it made him uneasy that I would know things that he hadn't told me about, that he was up to. Just not his affairs even. It was just other things he'd be doing, or where he'd be, or what was happening. So, and then we had the ghost or whatever it was, poltergeist in the nursery school house, and had to get that. I had to get rid of that, get that moved on out, or at least to have it stop pestering. And my husband at the time did witness things with that, and he didn't act to me like it unnerved him, but later he left me a letter saying how it had, after when his goodbye letter, I guess it was. But so anyway, I started reading these Catholic books. Not a lot, but I did get a Francis de Sales book, Introduction to the Devout Life, and started reading that. And then Teresa's Life, and I think I also got Way of Perfection because I liked her life. Or I might have read Way of Perfection first, I don't know, but I really liked her writings, and it all made sense to me. And what Merton wrote, it all made sense. All of the attributes and aspects of God and holiness and virtues, and I had already read through all the C.S. Lewis books I could get my hands on. I read. And I also read some books, 2 or 3 or 4 of what you would call self-help books for, people who've gone through divorce or having changes in their lives, or that kind of stuff. And tinging on light psychology. But my main interest was in spiritual and religious because of how my life was opening up with these experiences happening with God and other personages. So that was how I got more inclined. And then the more I was Lutheran, and we'd have these little side classes, like, what Lutherans believe about baptism or things. And my family doctor taught some of this adult Sunday school Bible study things. He's excellent. His father taught also excellent. I loved his father and mother. They were like extra grandparents to my children and lovely to me. And I loved all the people in that church. They were, especially after my surgery, the big surgery that happened, and the women backed off some of their fears because I was so maimed. But still, for the most part, they didn't want much to do with me, but older women would. And I'm lovely people that I met and enjoyed their company. And I know, even though while I was still there with these classes and I read Luther's Here I Stand, and I thought, oh my, I knew it really wasn't the church for me after all, with the basics and their views on baptism and things. But I wouldn't have, and I knew where the Catholic Church was, and I wanted to go. I would have liked to. I knew if I had stayed, I would have had to have at some point, looking back. But it was too hard because of the people. It's a small town. It's too hard at that time because the people really helped me, and I just couldn't do that. And with the Lutherans, they are more strongly against. There's more of a divide between Lutherans and Catholics, in the attitude, at least, of the Lutherans toward the Catholics, because that was the main split, was from Martin Luther in his time period, then in 1526, I think it was. So, but I realized that things that were being said, like the family doctor, one time in his Sunday school class, he talked about, I think the Lutherans, it's called consubstantiation, they believe in, with the communion. But he talked about how the Catholics believe in transubstantiation, and he talked about why it was wrong. But inside of me, there was like this voice saying, no, it's not wrong. That's the correct. And to me, even intellectually, it made perfect sense that there was this miraculous transubstantiation of the host and the blood, the wine, became Christ's blood and Christ's body, as in Scripture. Of course, I was having all kinds of increased amount of religious experiences that I think maybe I mentioned one to the doctor. I did try to talk with the district superintendent of the Lutheran church and the minister, and they didn't. The district superintendent really stepped on me and said, I don't know what it is, and you don't either, and you'd better stop messing around with these things, And I knew I couldn't help it. It wasn't anything I was messing with. But I knew in my deepest parts that what the Catholics believed with the bread and the wine becoming Christ's body and blood was, yes, that's how it was. And because I knew, because of miracles and because of the unusual experiences I was having. It was like there was no big leap there. I could see how that was accurate. I never said anything, of course, but I knew that differences were building, strong ones, between myself and what I knew deep within me and what Lutheran dogma and things were, what their theology was. So that was one thing. So but we got moved back to my hometown in the Midwest, and that was a miracle. And some of the women were really becoming wonderful with me, couple of younger women who realized that I was genuinely okay, but that I was just very, very religious and loved God and so the one woman who drove me to the court in San Diego and stayed during the court and then drove me back, she knew that she had witnessed a miracle in the courtroom regarding the judge letting us leave the state to go 2,200 miles away back to the hometown for the children to be able to leave. And she witnessed the ex-husband and how he acted to the judge, which helped the judge see through what was going on with him and how vicious and terrorizing he was, my ex was. So realized that we needed to get away for our safety and for particularly my safety, but for the children's well-being. And then they could go visit summer and Christmas, every other Christmas and every summer they were to go visit. But of course, the girls by then were old enough, they didn't need to go. But once he had this girlfriend that had children around their ages, they were better. And they didn't mind going because the kids could hang out together. And their dad would move to these wonderful places. He had all kinds of money. He was superintendent by then in different places. And one was some islands. And and they felt, I think, safer with having his girlfriend there. And then they eventually got married. But so we were back in my hometown. And I started having more locutions. I didn't know what they were called. And I'd wake up at night, like at 3, and there would be a word in white against the black of the room. Mortification was this one word. Mortification. And I didn't understand it. And I called. By then, I had already been back to my hometown Methodist church and realized I'd outgrown where they were in their Bible study and everything else. So, and I realized the children weren't getting that much. We had more in the Lutheran church in California, more education for them. And they kept having trouble with the youth group, young men leaving, and one got in trouble with molesting or something, but that was after we had left. And went to another church, a church in my hometown connected with a college there that was a United Brethren church. And it took courage to leave my hometown church that I grew up in, because I had people I loved there, and I knew they wouldn't understand, and I didn't want to insult. But even one time when my mother and dad were visiting and we went, and I asked some questions, and my mother even interjected with people she'd known all her life. Well, my daughter here has been studying these things, trying to put people a little more less like, well, where'd she get all this regarding me? Well, yes, I had been delving for my this who I was coming out, very spiritual and very religious and a mystic, but didn't know that then. So the word had been used once, and that was in my goodbye letter by the ex-husband that he wrote, that he never liked my mysticism. It's the first time and only time in that whole time period I had ever had that word presented. So we went to this college church, and I think we were there about 2 years or less, but had very in-depth adult Bible studies, and educational opportunities for the children were very good. And so it was just, and a lot of their friends from high school went there. So I always wanted my children to get the best I could possibly find for them in whatever aspect, high school classes or camps or anything, or religious education also, and youth group. The college church had larger youth group, which made it nice for my children. They were used to more where we had come from. So I didn't want them to suffer in any way. Not that it was suffering, but to have what would be the best I could find. So we did that. So when I had that mortification, I called the assistant minister, who I could sense was more amenable to me than the minister was. And I didn't know why the minister had turned against me, because I wasn't in any group that he was in, and it was probably just something he sensed about me that bothered him. But the assistant minister said, well, I'm not sure what mortification would mean. I knew it was something spiritual, just from everything that had been happening to me for years. Since, it was opening up rapidly, my soul and everything was being opened up. So he says, but I know someone who would be able to help you. My wife, he says, is a nurse at the infirmary at the convent, the Catholic convent at the edge of town. And I'll drive you there and introduce you to this sister that my wife really likes. And so I met her. She would be able to help you. And that woman, I think she was the administrator at the time, or the Mother Superior, they used to call them. I didn't realize at the time that convent was going through a change. The religious sisters had sort of revolted, and had the bulk of them have gotten together and made some changes in what they termed things and their outlook and what their agenda was going to be. It got more away from God and holiness and more into politicized aspects of wanting to change the Catholic Church, change the structure and the administrative style. And the women wanted to be priests. So I didn't realize when I first was there talking with them, but maybe after a month or two, or maybe even several months, with this one sister, she says, well, I have someone else that I want you to talk with. So then entered this, I think Sister Margaret Rose or something, and a lovely woman, or Mary Margaret, and then the more I got into deeper things, or sharing some of my experiences, the more I felt safe to share some of them. Because ever since I left California and Dr. H was there, who I could talk to about these unusual experiences and things that he had witnessed or been part of. I didn't have anyone to talk to, and I just kept diaries, journals. But I then could start telling the sister some things. So, and she explained things so well and so beautifully. It was like a meeting of souls. But she had someone else that she wanted me to talk with. She said that it was out of her depth. So she got this Sister Henrietta. And that's who then I talked to, and we became great friends. And at the time, see, the women did not at all let on to me, an outsider, and not even Catholic, anything about what they were doing behind the scenes. I just assumed they were a traditional convent, loyal Catholic women, upholding the church, orthodox, doing what they're supposed to do, lives of prayer and penance and all. And they did do lives of prayer, but they had a lot of meetings going on. And after a couple or 3 more years, I realized what they were about, because Sister Henrietta, who became my very good friend and my godmother, she was my sponsor when I became Catholic. I finally overheard her talking and realized also, though, she was grooming me to join this group, Call to Action it was called. I don't know if it's still in operation. But I'd asked a seminarian I'd gotten to know in the hometown when he would come home for like Christmas break. What is this? And we would correspond. I've kept all these letters. And he says, oh, stay away from that. That's a dissenting group, a dissenters. They're fighting. They're trying to break up, change the church. The sisters are, but it's sad because they will never succeed. And I realized, no, they wouldn't. Not the things they wanted and why. It comes back to what I've learned about the Virgin Mary. Who has more power than any other human being than the Virgin Mary had in all of history? So, be content with being a woman. And I'm not going to get into women's or women's rights. We have rights. I mean, I do. And society is catching up. Women can have about any career. Pay scale hasn't caught up yet. Sometimes the positions, as far as who gets elevated to higher positions, no. But there are other aspects of being a woman that I would not trade for anything. Certain aspects that are connected with wisdom and perception, and of course, having children can be a good thing, a very beautiful thing, and of which only women can have that quality or gift. So anyway, but I got to know Sister Henrietta, and then, but in the meantime, though, I kept having dreams. I kept having dream after dream, and it got to be nightly. And I would be going through streets in the hometown, up and down streets, but often I would be going up a one-way street. And one in particular I would be on. I would be in a car, driving, or not in a car, but just as if I were driving in these dreams. And it would always stop on this street called Cherry Street, down toward the, partway down the hill, but up partway, maybe midway. And there was this building on the left, but it was obscured. I wasn't shown in the dream exactly what the building was. But we'd go up and down streets until that one, and I would be stopped, but I would be facing the opposite direction of what it was in real life for that street. And then I also was doing a column for the hometown newspaper on history makers. I would interview different people who had connections with earlier history of the town or relatives with it. Well, one man I interviewed was an elderly man, and his father, and then he took it over, but his father, of course, was deceased by then, started an ice cream company in the hometown. And later on, it was bought out by a major national company, but they were unusual in that they were, I think, one of the first packaged ice cream companies in the country, something like that. It had some fame to it. But I went out to his home to interview him because he was older and more infirmed, and his wife was definitely infirmed. She had had some strokes. So he asked me to come out there to interview him out there. So I did, and right as we were getting started, the doorbell rang. He excused himself. I was in the living room, and there was the entry. It was an old farm house, but in very wonderful condition, but probably late 1800s was when it was built. So the entry entered into the main living room, sitting room, and so he goes to get it. He says, "Excuse me," he says, "I'm expecting someone for my wife." He says, "Well, we're Catholic, and the priest is coming with communion for her to visit her." So in walks this priest. Oh, I need to back up. I had this uncle I was mentioning. My grandmother's, she had 2 sons and 6 daughters, and it was her younger of the 2 sons. He had married a Catholic woman. When I was real little, I sensed, and I would ask my grandmother, why don't we all do more with this uncle's family? Well, my grandmother wouldn't answer me, but my mother would make comments about, well, he had married a Catholic. He had married a Catholic woman. And what was worse is when his fourth child was born, the little boy was born with a cancerous kidney that had to be removed. And her brother, my mother's brother, the little boy's father, had at that point become Catholic. It was a promise he had made. Let my baby live. Let this cancerous kidney be removed, and I will join. Because he had held out all that time. But it still affected. Imagine how it is. It was a small town that people, even within a family, would have such strong feelings against Catholicism that they would distance from a brother and his family because he became Catholic. Or at first because he married a Catholic woman. That was bad. That was bad enough. So that had happened. So anyway, this uncle, though, and it wasn't his first wife, my aunt, and the mother of all my cousins in that family, she passed away fairly young. So he remarried. And it was the second wife who also then, in older age, got sick and died. And she was Catholic also. So the funeral mass was viewing at a funeral home and then to the church for the mass. And my other relatives wouldn't go to the mass. They went to the funeral home, but they were not going to go to a Catholic mass. Well, I'd read my books already, Teresa, I hadn't read Catherine of Siena then, I wasn't aware of that. Teresa of Avila and Francis de Sales. And I'd had the incredible experience in California of the wedding of my soul and of John the Baptist talking to me. And that huge flower that I saw, it's in an earlier video when I talk about these visions back in 1988. But it was a St. John's wort. And then I found out the story behind the St. John's wort. And that John the Baptist feast day was, one of them is the 24th of June, and it was the 24th of June when this incredible experience happened. But I'd also been forewarned of it happening in April. So all of these connections. So I wasn't going to not go to the funeral mass. I wasn't going to do that to my uncle and my cousins. That just seemed a step too far to have that kind of fear. I think it was fear. Even my cousin who was close, she wouldn't go in. And there was going to be, I think, a reception later, so they were just going to wait around. But no, they weren't going to dare step into a Catholic church like that. But I did. And toward the end of this funeral mass, a voice inside of me said, "And this is where your funeral will be." Well, I immediately said back, "Well, no, I'm not Catholic. It won't be here." So anyway, when I was jumped forward, it was like 2 years later when I was interviewing this man and in his home on the floor, because I'd have to be reclined on the floor and take my notes like that, because sitting, I had no pain meds then. I could not sit without dire consequences of a pain siege that would go on for several days after. And it wouldn't happen immediately. It would be the next day if I sat in a chair. So I saw this priest come in. I was introduced to him. And as soon as he came in and looked at me, it was as if from 2 years prior, the voice was just finishing the sentence. The voice in me said, "And this is the priest that you're going to go to." And I thought, what? I'm not going to any priest. So anyway, the priest went in with communion or what for the wife. And this Mr. Klepper came back, and I interviewed him and wrote the article and etc., which he liked very much, I found out later. They all liked their articles when they would be written and put in the paper. Did my conscientious best. At that time, I didn't know Omnia Pro Deo, all for God. So, but I was still talking with somebody at the convent. And, or maybe that was I might have my timing off or something. Might have been around that time or a little later. I started talking with I think I was talking with one of the sisters at the convent, maybe Sister Henrietta. And it was like once a month. First it started out once a month. Then when I got into more, it was like once every couple of weeks I would go out. Or even once a week sometimes. The more I became hungry, waiting to go talk with his sister. And we were close, and she did an honorable thing, not bringing in any of this behind the scenes stuff she was involved with. She did not ever. I was the one that discovered it after the fact, later on, several years later, or a few years later. But I learned so much, and everything just made perfect sense to me. Everything. I would ask questions. She never pushed anything on me, never proselytized me, never ever said anything, "Do you want to become a Catholic?" No, not at all. She just gave of her time. And we had these delightful conversations about all things Catholic that I was curious about, and all things religion, Jesus, Scripture. She gave me so much of her time and her life. And I'm sorry that I did break off when she got unhappy with me after I had been Catholic then. But I had these dreams, I was saying, get off kilter here, had these dreams that were going around this town, always stopping on the wrong way on this heading uphill of a street that's a downhill street. Cherry Street it was called, still is. and by a building, but I didn't see the building ever in the dream. So, and then I heard that the voice saying, and this is the priest you're going to talk with. I think it was still either a half year later, maybe that was in the fall, and then by winter, this dream just kept getting more and more and more of being in this spot. I still didn't understand where I had stopped, where I was being stopped, going uphill on a downhill street. But it was somebody else at this college church who had become Catholic, and I found out that she was actually converting, even though her husband, and he was a doctor in the town, he was going to divorce her. And the church people, the ministers, he was on boards because being a doctor, he was utilized on the church boards. They were advising him to divorce his wife for becoming Catholic. Well, she kept praying and praying. Of course, this long story short on that is he and their family became Catholic, but which shocked people. But I'd found out about that, but in the meantime, I had already finally called that priest. I kept getting nudges day and night that I was to call that priest, that one that I'd met. And I might have even called this man back to ask what parish he was in. I didn't know it was called a parish, what church. I knew nothing of those types of details, really. I was such a neophyte, even talking with the religious sisters. So I did. I had my first meeting with the priest, and the rest is history, more or less. But I did, when I got to that church, and it was the street, it was on the street, this Cherry Street, that goes the other way, and the building that I kept being stopped by in those dreams, year and 2 years prior, was that church building. And that's where I was confirmed, and maybe it'll be where I'll have my funeral mass. I don't know for sure, because after I did become Catholic and I thought about those statements 2 years apart, and this is where you'll have your funeral mass, and this is the priest you're to see. The funeral mass, I thought, well, God may have meant in the Catholic Church. And that was my reaction. Anyway, that's how I took it. No, I'm not Catholic. It won't be here. But if it is, it will be in the Catholic Church. So it took, all this process took 10 years. 10 years. Really, probably, I bet if I had written down the day that I was asked to join that group of teachers at Beverly Hills High, with the art teacher who was Catholic, saying in an uncanny way, just looking at me as soon as I sat down, you need to read this book. He didn't know me. We hadn't met. Things like that, they stand out. They stand out. But something in him saw something in me. Well, after the first Mass I went to was, I think that was before maybe it was after I talked to the priest one time. I talked to him it was on March 29th of 1995. I had an appointment with him. And I think it was at Easter or Palm Sunday or something that my son wanted to go to Mass with me and experience that. And it was an amazing experience in Mass. It was lovely, and there wasn't anything scary or bad that I was concerned about. I was sort of braced. I sort of didn't want to have my son going with me if there was some kind of worship of Mary going on. See, that was my background. That's what I was told that they do, is worship Mary. No, they don't. Nothing was mentioned. It was all scripture being read. The sermon was all scripture. It was such a relief compared to some of the other Protestant churches I'd been in, where there wasn't the emphasis on scripture in the service, in the Mass or whatever. I had to get all of this lingo, understand Mass. Compared to Protestants, it's worship service. And that's not to say that there aren't Protestant churches that don't have very deep and meaningful sermons on scripture. It's just, in my experience in the hometown, they would read the Bible in the services, but not necessarily get into it quite as much spiritually or biblically, delving into it as much. And they might now too. They might do that now more. I don't know. And I know plenty of Protestant churches do, so I'm not putting down any. This was just my experience in 1995 in a small town, the differences. And I also then, the very first Mass I went to, I just stayed in the back with my son. Just stay seated. But I sensed something from the front of the church. We sat in the back, way in the back. Maybe it was even up in part of the choir loft. One of the times my son and I did, one of the first times we did, because it was so packed, jam-packed. I was, wow, look at all these people. It was and no Mary worship. Ooh, that was a stunner for me. But I think we were on the first floor then. We weren't up in the choir loft that time. I sensed something, a strong pull, a powerful pull, coming from the front of that church, what's called the sanctuary. I didn't know then, but where the altar is and everything, and behind the altar, I felt this incredible draw of a power up there. And when the priest at the altar, and he held this host up, it was a profound experience of something very, very strong and powerful. Still didn't know that there was a tabernacle up there, or what was happening at the altar. I mean, I'd read the books, but I wasn't as sure of things. I was there in real time, and everything was so new and different. And but the sermon was on the gospel that they read, and the priest had read the gospel, and they had a psalm. It was a Sunday. They had a psalm. They had a Old Testament reading, and they had an epistle reading. Oh, Bible, Bible, Bible. I loved it. As opposed to maybe the minister at the Protestant church picking one or two, or going through several parts of the Bible, picking out scriptures to make a point and using personal stories to help make the point and to bring it all together, even things of his family, or he would get into his own ideas, the minister at this last church I was at, about soccer and kids playing soccer and just whatever. Get off onto different topics or political topics or things. So, and then over time I noticed in the Catholic Church they're supposed to stick with the scripture. They're not to get into politics. No preaching like that from the pulpit. No other kind of preaching, but scripture. And and most of them do, it's content oriented. It's not personally oriented. And so anyway, it was just so different, and it was so focused on worship and adoration, and giving God his due. I never went back anywhere else after that. And at times, because it's been rough on me, the devil hasn't maybe liked me being Catholic. Jesus certainly was pleased. I've mentioned this in other videos, that before my confirmation date, which the priest himself selected what date it would be, I went through instruction for about, would have been 5 or 6 months, and a good 5 months. And he, finally said, well, what do you want to do? He'd spend an hour to 2 hours every week talking, going over things, and gave me books to read and videos to watch. And he didn't want me in the regular class with the other new members. They go through for a full year, though, or nearly a year, September through to Easter. At least at that church they do. And they meet 2 hours once a week. So I was impressed with that too. All the Protestant churches is about a 3-week during Sunday school time, on Sunday morning the hour, and it was a new member class, and you would learn, John Wesley started this one, John Calvin started that one, Martin Luther started this other one, so-and-so started this, or the shoot off of one of these others, how the United Brethren got started. Don't remember the man who started, I don't think it was anyone who was as dominant as the name John Wesley or John Calvin, but there's always someone who starts the churches. Oh, this was a big detail I left out. Earlier, when I was starting to feel I'd already been through all these different churches in California, and even with my husband at the time, we would try different ones. Then I had already gotten out of my hometown growing church I grew up in to go to the church that the college was affiliated with. And within about a year and a half, it was like, something's missing. But after the class on joining the last Protestant church I was in, and I was just struck, here's another person who started a church in early 1800s or something, or mid 1800s. My oldest sister had become Mormon. That started by some people just starting it. Joseph Smith and Brigham Young got involved, and older people who were around young Joseph Smith, and it's just, I started to pray, Jesus, what is the church you started? I realized I want to find out, what church did Jesus start? I didn't have any idea. I honestly didn't. But I thought, it's always these men, or Mary Baker Eddy, the Christian Scientist. Somebody had talked that up to me because of my pain. Try some Christian Scientism, for healing and things. The Power of Positive Thinking with Norman Vincent Peale. He was Presbyterian, but he wrote that famous book, and it is a good thing to have positive thinking. But it's more than just positive thinking. We're talking faith, we're talking God. God's the one that performs miracles. We don't. We can make good things happen, we think, but it's God who's doing it. It's good to be positive, but the miracles are God's domain, so that's understood. But I started praying. It was probably maybe 1992. That would have been when I started going to the college's church, and I started praying, Jesus, what church? And that's when the dream started in of up and down streets in the town and all around, and these locutions that I would need, and I did. I needed the Catholic sisters to help me unravel. They knew what mortification was. They knew all about suffering. They taught me so much about suffering and how I was being utilized with suffering. So it was, and so many things. I owe Sister Henrietta a debt of gratitude, and I have felt sorry that we did need to part ways because I wasn't going to be cultivated and harvested for an offshoot rabble-rousing group. I'm not Christian to be politicized or to try to disrupt something or change something that what the basic is, and the basis of it is Christ and his church, we the body, scripture, worship, praise of God, living the scriptures. It's not who does what and trying to create political adversity and not to be envious or bothered that we're women. And in this particular time period, and probably forever, and I never thought that women made effective ministers. I'll probably be attacked for this, but when I was in college, I had a theology course, first one, freshman year in college. I loved it. And I took a second one, but I had to drop out because I needed a surgery on my tailbone. That was how God always gets me to move in a direction he wants when I'm not doing it on my own or through kinder means. It's always something with my body happens that forces me to have to make a change. So I was in a second theology course, and I was seriously considering, I was going to have theology as my minor, and I was seriously considering ministry, being a Methodist minister, because in college I was Methodist. And but I thought it through, and the women ministers, there's something I had to admit that even the bodily voice and delivery and projection of a man's voice is stronger. And the leadership, the father image figure of a pastor, the head of the family. I had a wonderful dad, and my mother was never wishing she were a man. My mother had whatever freedom she wanted with her career, with travel, with she took my middle sister and myself, I was the youngest, to Europe with another teacher friend through their alma mater university, their teaching college alma mater, and wonderful experiences my mother had in life. And she loved she was organized women's clubs in the town and hosted things and was head of the Messiah production in the town for years. So my mother had everything she needed and wanted. And so there wasn't this feeling of inadequacy as being women. And of course, they had 3 daughters. And yes, there's still ways to go with equalities of certain ways and respect. How women are abused sexually assaulted. That's a horror that should never be. But the more I've got to know Mary intimately, as a very close friend and as a mother, a spiritual mother to me, no greater female mentor than Mary for how my situation with the HOA people, she would have handled it with graciousness and gentleness. She would have been firm, but wouldn't have gotten quite as upset as I was. I had trouble sleeping last night because, it just got to me. I don't want, they know, and they're ignoring, and the pressure and the bullying isn't helpful, but Mary would handle it very graciously but firmly. So I need to look to her more, and Jesus. People will be writing, don't worship Mary. I don't worship Mary. I admire her, and I appreciate her role as really the most powerful person on earth because of her closeness to her son. So that's another reason to be close to Jesus, is that connection. And of all the graces Jesus has, from the miraculous medal that I talked about. Here's my scapular. I'm getting off topic here, but it's a real old miraculous medal there. Very, very old. So that's pretty much my conversion story of how things just fit into place and how God got me where he wanted me to get. But the night before I had my confirmation, I had asked Jesus, do you really want me to do this? My parents found out, I told them that I was going to become Catholic. They were so upset. They cut me off. My mother packed up family photos, even my children's photos, me, everything. Anything that had been mine that she had kept as memento of me, and mailed it back to me. All of it. She cut me off. But about 6 months after cutting me off, it was right before Christmas, my aunt or someone must have told her I was having a terrible pain siege. It went on for a long time, 8 or 10 days. And it melted her. And she realized that she would try to accept. And my dad, too, he cried. Never seen my dad cry. And this older friend, a friend of my mother's and dad's, who had been out to visit, told me many times. She told me 3 or 4 times. Because I think she was upset. They all were upset. She told me people at the Methodist church, when they found out I'd become Catholic, were outside the church on the sidewalk after church. And the women were crying that I had become Catholic. People had that strong of feelings of anti-Catholicism, not understanding. It's a misunderstanding, and it's what they're indoctrinated with from their parents and grandparents and on down since 1526. So it's what we deal with. But Jesus told me that night when I asked him, do you really want me to do this? Because I have never done anything in my life that was such high stakes, as far as my whole life and my family, my sister and brother-in-law that I was very close with, and they cut me off. I think the first time was for 10 years, another time for 5. And, or maybe the first was for 5 or 6 years and then again for 10. But we've been on very close terms for maybe the last 8 years or 9 years, 8 years, I suppose. And that's good, thank heavens. Not with anything religion. I don't know if she thinks I'm not Catholic or what, but she and her husband got on the phone with me when I was called them to say I thought people would be excited and happy for me. I misread stuff. So for having insights given me in the temporal world, I misread things right and left. I'm just bonkers in the temporal world. I'm a misfit. But they both got on the phone and they were horrified that my son was wanting to be Catholic also. And they said it's one thing for you to go to hell, but to take an innocent 12-year-old boy with you is terrible. And when my dad had died, we were out there, or even another time when we were visiting, but I wanted to go to Mass, and they wouldn't take me. We had a rental car. My mother had us get a rental car, but they wouldn't let me have the keys to it to go. And stuff like that. I had found a cousin who also lived out there in that retirement area, and she dropped me off. But I wanted to. My father had died. I wanted to go to Mass. And I found out also then what it was in Catholics. It's the Eucharist in them. And I also found why the draw of that particular rounded area of the church from my childhood that I would stare at and be drawn to that. The tabernacle was there on the other side of the bricks and mortar. That on the inside of the church, that was the rounded part where the tabernacle stands. And that's why I was drawn to it. God ordained this with me from early on. And through not the neighbor girl and what she would talk about, it was through what I sensed. And what I sensed in Catholics when I would meet them, even adults, I would sense this something in them. And it's the Eucharist. Now, Catholics, Protestants, we're all human, we're all sinners. I know that. I know there's many things that are wrong. How humans started to make up stuff, or all these 1752 or however many canon laws there are now. And people who then become canon lawyers, and that's their careers. Now lay people are becoming canon lawyers. And I think, why? If we really followed the faith and the scriptures, there'd be no need for all these church laws and making up things so that we can accommodate society. But whatever, that's the temporal world and the temporal church. And all of the churches have their temporal aspects. Protestant, all of them. All religions. The Orthodox, the Jewish, the Muslim, they all have their temporal structure and aspects. I'm not talking about building structure. I'm talking about the longer the churches are there and the more people, there has to be structure. But in the end, when I asked Jesus, he says, yes, I want you to do this, for it pleases me. He says, it pleases me, and there was all this peals of joy and laughter in his voice, came out of his voice along with, for it pleases me. It pleased him that I was going to become Catholic. And then that evening, I'd prayed that during the day, or maybe it's the night before, and that was his answer, and I saw Jesus standing before me, giving me that answer. And then the next evening was my confirmation, private, and I had this tremendous sign that was witnessed by the priest and Sister Henrietta and my one daughter and son. The oldest daughter didn't want to come. She's been turned away from church for a long, long time, ever since this nursery school situation, the ghost or whatever it was. She became more adverse to prayer and religion and God, and so pray for her, please. Um, she views it now just as a corporation, just another corporation that takes your money. And yes, they need money to have the heat in the cold weather and the air conditioning in the hot. Make people comfortable, and people who are ill can go who wouldn't be able. I couldn't go someplace that didn't have air conditioning because of my pain. It causes the tissues to swell and press on the nerves. Humidity and heat does. So anyway, it just was one step after another, and it all fit in. And it's been a hard road for me as a Catholic. I think because I'm different, because I'm a mystic, definitely, and some of the assignments I've had from God, things that I've seen that I had to report or suggest, or the ecstasies. That was the main thing that put an end to my going to Mass. And so that's it. And I've just had so many blessings. I was in love. I was in a honeymoon period. And I still am. I still am in love with Catholicism. All the spiritual, it's all there. If the whole world would run by even the Catechism, there's so much sense and decency and common sense in the Catechism. It all makes sense. It all fits together. And just the power of the Mass and the glory of the Mass. And that's part of the reason why all these people we've talked about, these holy souls and their locutions that God fills in even more for us. And Jesus comes to us. He answers our questions. He helps us. He answers our prayers. He gives miracles. He provides healings and of all types. And of course, I think the most important healing is spiritual healing, spiritual growth and spiritual healing, because that's eternal. I wrote an article once, it got published. When healing doesn't come, what then, Lord? And that got published a couple of times, and it's true. All the people who were miraculously cured in the Bible, they all died. They're not alive now, except on the other side. So it's a shift in perception too. Anyway, I don't have regrets whatsoever. I do in certain things that I did, but that's on me. I think I wished I had maybe been more gracious or more calmed or something. I don't know. Anyway, but God bless His real presence in us. This is very long, but this is my conversion story.